as they come in.
Agreed. Okay, moving on to public hearings. Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Jacob Kane, City Planner. Apologize in advance. I'm going to take this presentation slow. There's a lot of information in it. I know some of it's complicated. Most of what you'll be hearing from me tonight is similar to what you heard me present last month. And so there may be some redundancy, but for the benefit of those watching and in attendance, and also for yourselves to reacclimate yourselves with the proposal, I'm just going to move through it slowly. I would suggest that if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to entertain them as I present. Since there are so many issues before you, it may be beneficial for everybody if we do it that way. First, I think it would be helpful to go back to the beginning of this M2 redevelopment process to sort of frame how we got to where we are today. Back in 2009, the Planning Commission had its first discussion of the potential of using occupancy incentives and utilizing Section 154.007, the non-conforming lots and uses, as a means of facilitating M2 redevelopment projects. At that time, the Planning Commission was receptive to that idea, and subsequent to that discussion, the first project, the first M2 redevelopment project was approved at 802 South Main Street. Throughout 2010 and 2011, there was ongoing discussion by the Planning Commission about design criteria for M2 redevelopments and the terms associated with the use of the 1 to 2 occupant incentives. In 2012, the City Commission required procedures be documented, and as a result, the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board of Appeals crafted and adopted written procedures. Those procedures were subsequently revised in 2013, and those are the procedures that we continue to utilize today. Later in 2013, at the request of the City Commission, Rural Professional Services Company was engaged to conduct an M2 study. For those of you who were on the Planning Commission at the time, you'll recall that among the study items was an inventory of the homes in the M2 district, as well as an outcome of 3 proposals that were presented for Planning Commission consideration. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on those in a second. Later in 2013, the Planning Commission held work sessions in September, October, and November. One of those was a joint meeting with the Zoning Board of Appeals. There were 2 public open houses in early January 2014, and the Planning Commission continued discussions on the item in March, April, May, June at a work session, August, and September 2014, and finally had a joint meeting with the City Commission in September 2014. Coming out of that discussion, the Planning Commission considered the consultant's alternatives for the M2 redevelopment procedure, the as-is process, which was essentially a codification of current procedures that we continue to use today, an SUP alternative, which would have required a special use permit for these redevelopment projects, and an overlay option, which would have basically created a map within which different standards would apply. After consideration of those alternatives, in December of 2014, the Planning Commission moved the as-is alternative forward to the City Commission 5-4. So 2015, first big news is you got a new city planner. So this is where I and some of you newer planning commissioners start to be involved in this process. In January, the City Commission received the Planning Commission's recommendation to adopt the as-is process, and rather than take action on it, they requested that a joint meeting be set up between the Planning and City Commissions to discuss what they felt were some deficiencies in the as-is proposal. A new proposal was brought back to them for consideration. So in February, we had that joint meeting between the 2 commissions. Coming out of that meeting in March, we had a Planning Commission work session. That's the work session where we talked about some of the basic principles that you all were interested in exploring with regard to a new M2 redevelopment proposal, as well as we developed the plan of action, I'm calling it. So we established what the schedule or timeline would be as we move forward in consideration of the issue. So the following items you'll see were all on that plan of action. In April, we hosted a neighborhood walking tour. We met at Fancher Elementary School, and we went on a very informal walk through both the R3 and M2 districts between High and Bellows Street to talk a little bit about the neighborhood's concerns with the projects that have been built, as well as with existing M2 and R3 properties. Members of the Neighborhood Resource Unit, those are folks from the police and fire departments, were in attendance. I believe at least 3 of you were in attendance at that neighborhood walk. And we had a variety of feedback. Coming out of that meeting, one of the things we did is we published a frequently asked questions document on our website, and we actually created a special M2 redevelopment page because many of us found, staff who were in attendance as well as the planning commissioners, that there was a lot of the perceived issues in the M2 and R3 areas related to a lack of information about why things were the way they were and what folks see and why is it the way it is and how do they get help if there's an issue. And so we put that document out there in an effort to ensure that those questions could be answered. In May, we had an open house before our planning commission meeting where we gave folks another opportunity to come and talk with you all about their concerns with the M2 redevelopment process and with the neighborhood. In June, the planning commission, we held another work session. That's where the framework for the proposal before you tonight was developed. And so what you see tonight is staff's best effort at capturing your feedback on what you wanted to see in terms of a new M2 redevelopment proposal put into language for your consideration. Last month, we introduced that draft language and we had our first discussion on the proposed text changes. And tonight, the item is before you for public hearing. As you're well aware, a number of the issues in the M2 neighborhood have and more to do with code enforcement and behavior. And so there's a number of other things that are happening within the city that are aimed at addressing those issues. The first is the City Commission has allocated funding to hire an additional code enforcement officer with the intention of providing a dedicated code enforcement officer for the area south of High and north of Bellows Street. That hiring process is underway, and my understanding is that they hope to have the position filled by early September. So we'll be seeing some additional code enforcement boots on the ground, not just in this neighborhood, but citywide as a result of an extra hire. The city's created a neighborhood resource unit, which is an effort to streamline code enforcement and rental licensing activities and to provide for enhanced outreach to the community. That's been in place in a pilot form since January, and it was recently finalized over the summer. There's been an adjustment, there's a planned adjustment Pleasant Police Department will be utilizing with starting this fall. And so we're anticipating that the police department's reaction to issues of nuisance partying, noise, and other issues is going to be different than we've seen in years past, with the hope that that approach will be effective in curtailing some of the problems of the past. Finally, planning staff, your city planner, I'm working on 2 different initiatives that will be coming before you at some point, hopefully later this year. One is a report on recommendations related to blight, property maintenance, and enforcement. So what I've done is I've cataloged our existing policies and ordinances that relate to those issues, and I'm looking at other communities to see how they handle those issues. And we'll be bringing it forward to you for consideration of any recommendations that this commission may wish to make to the city commission on any changes to our approach we might want to make. And that's for both rental properties and owner-occupied properties. And finally, staff's also working on a report related to the owner-occupied incentive program. For those of you who don't know, funds were allocated in the early 2000s to incentivize owner-occupation of rental properties in the city. Starting in 2009, those funds began to be distributed. To date, 12 folks have taken advantage of the program. And so the time was ripe to take a look at how and where that program's been successful and whether or not that's a program that would merit any changes or additional funding in the future. And so, again, that's something I would anticipate that will be prepared for consideration later this year. So, to go back to June. So in June, following the public outreach that occurred earlier this year, we sat down in a work session and talked about what your goals were for a new M2 redevelopment proposal. And at that time, we basically distilled those goals into 6 areas. The first, and I think the most important tonight, is the creation of a transition area within the M2 district adjacent to the R district. This was a major focus of the City Commission and an impetus for their sending the issue back to the Planning Commission for consideration. And you'll recall we spent a great deal of time in that work session talking about the parameters of what a transition area would look like, how it would function, what properties would be included, et cetera. Second was a desire to preserve the neighborhood look and feel, not just in the R3 neighborhood, but in the M2 neighborhood. What I heard from many of you and what I've heard from many people in the community is that there's a desire to maintain the look of a single-family property, even if it's a multiple-unit property or a rooming and boarding dwelling or an RSO, rather than having large, long apartment buildings and the like that feel less in context with the existing neighborhood. That's in keeping with many of the outcomes we've received out of the current redevelopment procedure, and so to the extent that we could, we've maintained the language that helps us to get to that place, and then we've added new language that will hopefully bolster that, those outcomes. We've maintained the involvement of the Zoning Board of Appeals in the review of non-conforming redevelopment projects. You may recall, for those of you who were engaged in the earlier processes before 2015, that 2 of the 3 proposals from Rowe, from the consultant, did not include continued involvement of the Zoning Board of Appeals. And I believe at our March work session, what I heard from you was that the continued involvement of the Zoning Board of Appeals was important, that you all felt that that led to better outcomes, and that having the dual public hearing process really gave the public much more opportunity to learn about and participate in the process of approval for those projects. And so that would remain in this process as well. Number 4 is a reduction in the impact of on-site parking. This is largely pulled from reactions from the neighborhood during the neighborhood walk. Many folks at that event talked with me and talked with some of you about the parking lots and the volume of asphalt and the paving of backyards and the overall lack of conformity and consistency of a parking lot with a residential district. And so what you'll see tonight in the recommendation is some flexibility introduced that will help to mitigate the presence of large parking lots, and also some steps taken to prevent the use of adjacent lots for parking lots for redevelopment projects. Part 5 relates to that as well. We look to eliminate the incentive to combine lots for redevelopment and also restrict the combination of existing platted lots for redevelopment. Again, with the idea that hopefully as projects redevelop, that the rhythm of the neighborhood, having a home on every lot rather than a home and a parking lot and a home and a parking lot or a series of parking lots, it'll really help to maintain that neighborhood look and feel. And then finally, number 6, again, something that I believe was strongly communicated to me in March and again in June, was a desire to continue to use occupancy incentives as a means to facilitate and incentivize redevelopment, but addressing some of the concerns with that previous occupancy incentive program by providing some limitations on how and when that's utilized. So I'm going to go through each of the text changes that's related to these 6 goals and tie them to the goals, and as I do that, go ahead and pop in and ask any questions you might have about the language. So goal number 1, create the transition area between the M2 district and R districts. Under section 154.054 C1D, which relates to registered student organizations, you're aware, I would imagine, that currently registered student organizations are not allowed to share a common lot line, be it a side or a rear, with any lot in an R single-family zone district. What we've added to that language is a provision that will also prevent an RSO from being established across a local street or alley from an R single-family zone district. And so essentially any Main Street in Washington Street and High Street are not local streets. So, but there are also, Main and Washington are fully within the M2 district. There's no R district properties adjacent. They would continue to be allowed on High Street, and we actually have some existing, the 802 South Main project is an existing RSO that's on High Street. That'll remain conforming. You'll recall in June we discussed that transition area and whether or not High Street would serve as a sufficient buffer, and the general feeling was that yes, it would. So that's the proposal there. So that's basically going to strengthen the limitations on the locations of registered student organizations with regard to the location of the adjacent R districts. 154.054C2 deals with rooming and boarding dwellings. And so within the M2 zoning district, we basically have two sets of special rules, one for rooming and boarding dwellings, one for RSOs. And so you'll see some of this language ends up being duplicative because it has to appear in both sections as it relates to the special use permits for each use. So for rooming and boarding dwellings, currently the provision is that there cannot be a shared side lot line with an R single-family zone district, and that will remain. Staff has added the word line because obviously a common side lot, the word line is implied, so we're adding the word line in so that it's clear. With an R single-family zone district, that's not changing. What is changing and what's, in a sense, creating the transition zone that you defined in the June work session is the idea of limited unit occupancy in that area. And so the new language in Part E states no rooming and boarding dwelling with a common lot line or across an alley or local street from a property in the R district shall be permitted to have more than 4 occupants per dwelling unit. For all other rooming and boarding dwellings, there should be no more than 6 occupants per dwelling unit. Currently,
I want to make sure that I understand what a dwelling unit is. That would be a place that would be, that basically has a single shared kitchen, shared living space. A dwelling unit is not a bedroom. It's not the same thing as a bedroom.
correct. If you want to think of it this way, so a dwelling could be a single-family home. That's one dwelling unit. It could be a duplex. That'd be a dwelling with 2 dwelling units. You could have a multiple family dwelling that would have 3 or more units, so essentially apartments. Rooming and boarding dwelling could be 1 dwelling, 1 unit. This regulation is going to really encourage the use of multiple units within rooming and boarding dwellings so that those folks aren't sharing as much common space. So you're essentially creating multiple units within a rooming and boarding dwelling in not every case, but in many more cases than today. You'll see in a later section that's proposed for amendment that right now we actually have some restriction on the ability to create extra dwelling units. Keeping in mind that dwelling units don't necessarily create occupancy, and occupancy is capped other places. And so right now there's actually, it's very difficult to create multiple unit rooming and boarding dwellings in the M2 district. This will help to encourage that, hopefully, so that we have, right now, land area is the only control. So if someone were to come in with a large lot and propose to put 30 students in a rooming and boarding dwelling, there's nothing in the zoning ordinance that says that you can't do that. Now, you would still have some discretion in the special use permit approval to decide whether or not that made sense, but that's not explicitly prevented. This is a big change. What this says is that anywhere in any M2 district, you cannot have more than 6 occupants per unit in a rooming and boarding dwelling.
And how that is arranged within the within the boarding unit, it could be, if you had a 4-person dwelling unit, that could be a 4 bedrooms, it could be 2 bedrooms, it could be, we don't address that.
Right.
Okay.
We have provisions that deal with the amount of unit area per occupant. So each dwelling unit has to be a certain size per occupant, but we don't regulate whether or not there's 4 occupants that share 1 bedroom or 4 occupants that have 4 bedrooms.
But the most that you could have basically sharing a kitchen in this would be a kitchen and living room would be 4 people.
In the transition area, yes.
Okay,
That's correct.
If I could.
Yes, Mr. Daly.
So suppose you have, and I don't know that you do, you have one of these 66 by 120 lots that's a border lot. And that they may not exist. I don't know. I think you had said in the meeting last time that the 5,000, the reason you dropped to 5,000 was that there are 50 by 100 lots. But if you have a 66 by 120 lot, you have about 8,000 square feet. Yes? So technically by land area, you could put 8 people in there even before the ZBA might add 2. Am I correct so far?
Yes. Based on land area only, yes, you could.
Yes. Could you then put up a building on that lot that had 2 living units in it So, and I think we're dispensing with the word, well, this wouldn't be a duplex or a two single-family anyway, so
Right.
that language is moot here. You could actually put up a building that had 2 units in it and had 4 people per unit? I mean, is that?
Correct.
So you could end up with a lot with 8
Right.
legal residents.
Today, you could end up with a lot with 8 residents in 1 unit, and there's no provision to say that it has to be, that there has to be any division of units based on occupancy. This would mandate in the transition area that that's split into at least 2 units. Anywhere else in the district, it would also require 2 units because it would be over 6
Anyway,
anyway. And again, today, if you have the land area, and we primarily where we see really high occupancies, these are grandfathered properties that have had rental occupancies well above 15 or 20 since the 60s or 70s. The land area just simply doesn't allow that kind of occupancy rate today if you were to license something. And when I say, we talked about this in the work session, and I want to make clear that the 1 to 900 isn't the only controlling factor in the occupancy level. You still have to fit the parking on the site. You have to meet most of the setbacks. You may get some flexibility from the Zoning Board of Appeals, but you're generally speaking not going to get complete elimination. I mean, no one's gotten complete elimination of any setback. So by the time you do that, if you run the scenario on a 66 by 122 lot, you're going to have difficulty probably getting to 8 anyway. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but generally speaking, that's pretty tough to get to.
I mean, I do appreciate the intertwining of the rules that says, well, by land area you could add 2, but by unit, probably that can't happen anyway, except if you want to build another unit.
Right.
Just kind of the feel of buffer goes away for me a little bit when we say, oh yeah, we could put 8 people in there. I guess we have buffer, but it wasn't as much buffer as I had hoped when we had talked about buffer. Just comment.
Well, the lot combination provisions, because I think if you look at the...
I've picked a pretty kind of special circumstance, I admit.
I think so. I think if you look at the transition area map and you look at the current lot configurations, you'll find that most of those lots are on the smaller end of the neighborhood, and it's going to be very difficult if those lots can't be combined. When I ran some scenarios, imagined, okay, I'm redeveloping this property, I have to fit the setbacks, I have to meet the height requirement, I have to try to fit the parking even under the stacked parking provision. On a 50 by 100 foot lot, it's really difficult to exceed 5 people, even theoretically. So I think what you're going to find in most of the transition area is that under a redevelopment scenario, the most occupants you're going to see on a property are 6, and they're going to have to be split into 2 units by this rule. So again, not in every case, and the transition area is going to apply to every M2 district, and the High to Bellows neighborhood is not the only M2 district in town. And so some of the lots that are adjacent to our districts in the other M2 areas are larger, and are a totally different situation.
I mean, and I don't know if this communication made it into the group as a whole. Probably some of you got there where there were at least a couple of proposals that we not take 4 as that number. That 2 or 3 would be the per unit number.
But if you take 2, can I talk?
Absolutely.
Okay. If you take 2,
The chair.
you're back to an R2. You're in essence rezoning I don't think we ever intended to do that.
If you'll recall, in June when we ended our work session with this discussion, I heard from most, but not all of you, subsequent to the meeting, about your thoughts on this. My recollection, and I didn't write it down in a chart, but my recollection was actually that this proposal was quite a bit lower occupancy allowance per unit than what I heard from most of the folks who responded, who were generally of the 5 to 6 to 7. Again, my feeling was, much like I think what you're alluding to, in order to have a meaningful transition area, you need to be lowering occupancy somewhat. And what that number is, again, I would agree with Commissioner Horgan that lowering to 2 is in effect rezoning the property to a different zoning district, and if that's what is desired, that's a different process. 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, that's, again, when we came back in July, we came back with 4. Is it a magic number? No, I don't think any zoning number is magic. A 6.5-foot setback or a 7-foot or an 8-foot or a 9-foot could probably all be good or bad depending on the circumstance. But I think 4 gives you that a meaningful enough reduction to function as a transition area without turning it into a duplex that would be an R district type use.
Well, I don't know that I have a problem with 4. It just started, in some of the communication, people say, well, okay, and now you're going to allow up to 2 extra above the land area.
That's discretionary, though, correct?
Right, and you'll recall that of the approved M2 projects to date, there's only been 1 that I can think of, and I think it's the only one where there's been 2 occupants awarded. And there's a high threshold expected in terms of architectural excellence and other site criteria in order to get that. One of the things that we'll get to later, and I'll just share it now because I think it would be helpful to understand. One thing that I think, regardless of the outcome tonight, that we'll need to do in order to move forward with this issue is because this is basically a split process. The Zoning Board of Appeals weighs in, and then the Planning Commission, that we certainly need to sit down in a joint meeting between the 2 boards to discuss how we move forward with this or whatever the proposal is, so that there's an understanding of what the expectations are going forward. I certainly don't have I certainly understand and I would affirm your concern to the extent that, yes, the language theoretically would allow the awarding of 2. And if that's something that the group is uncomfortable with, I think we could certainly change that in the transition area if that would be of help. But I need to know what everyone's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I might be back with that, but that's for later. Because it's quite a jump. You say, well, we meant 4, but we can really do 7, even on a 5 by 100.
Oh, and I want to clarify that the bonus occupants awarded doesn't negate the unit occupancy max.
Right.
So if you can get 4 on there by land area, and you get 2 more, that doesn't mean you get a 6-person unit. Right. You can add a unit to that. Are there any other questions on this particular section? Okay. Goal number 2, preserve the neighborhood look and feel, consistent with the outcomes of the current process. And so what you'll see, this is where we have some duplicated language under both the rooming and boarding dwellings and the registered student organizations. This is essentially based on the as-is process that was previously moved forward, and that process itself was based on the endorsed redevelopment procedures that the Planning Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals developed in 2012 and amended in 2013. What I've highlighted for you in yellow is a modification to that language from last month. So you'll recall last month you would have seen 3 sections here, 1, 2, and 3. Essentially, building and site aesthetics were grouped together based on some very emotional feedback from one of your fellow planning commissioners. I took a look at that language, and what I've done is I've split the building aesthetics and the site appearance, site aesthetics into 2 separate sections, and I've attempted to beef up the requirements for site aesthetics and provide some additional flexibility in the regulations so that the Zoning Board of Appeals can consider preservation of existing healthy and non-invasive trees as an element of a M2 redevelopment project. And so basically give them some additional flexibility, give the developer additional flexibility that if there's a meaningful tree or trees on the property, they can get some additional accommodations if the Zoning Board of Appeals concurs in order to preserve that tree, whether it's a reduced setback or modified parking arrangement or something to that regard. And so that's what you're seeing there. Any questions on that particular section? Mr. Daly.
commonly in this sort of language, when you say including it, commonly, I shouldn't go that far, it might say but not limited to. Now, we may mean this is the included list, so
Oh, I see what you're saying.
you can't go out of that. Because that's what you mean, that's fine. I think that goes a long ways to getting us, I don't know how much of northern Chicago we're actually going to look like in this case. But,
Sure.
Which is a very characteristic kind of place. So I don't know if there's, is it meant that is the pool of things, or is it meant that is some examples of the pool of things?
Well, to date, that has been the pool of things, I think, by and large, have been limited to those areas. I think that I would be interested to know if there's anything that you all feel is not included in the list that should, or if you are interested in that and providing that flexibility to yourself to consider other items. I think that was certainly the intent is including but not limited to. I think that has been the intent and the practice, but I think in practice it has been limited to that list.
It was kind of an offering to the group if this suffices for the right group of things.
I wonder if it's something we can address if somebody down the road comes up with something and via some sort of minimal text change, if there's something that I'm unaware
Some
of.
of them might be more creative, but would the planning commission say, no, we can't do that, it's not on the list, even though it's a good idea? It may be a silly thing to worry about.
I think that the use of the word including, to me, includes means there may be some other stuff besides what we've already listed here.
What?
I think that's implicit in the word include.
And the words such as, it's kind of like, here's some
And
examples.
here's an example.
Right.
I think that that's
Yeah,
implicit in
that's-
the wording.
That's fine, I'll withdraw the idea. We did have communication through the day, lots of it. And this one offered that we might add the word historic homes, taking into consideration the shape, location, and architectural detail of historic homes in the neighborhood, which gives a different tone. I just wanted to make sure the group heard that.
Is the term historic homes a defined term, or is that just a descriptive word?
I don't think it's defined anywhere in the document, no.
Right. I think my concern, and I think the reason why the endorsed procedure doesn't use that language is the fact that we don't have any quote-unquote historic homes in that neighborhood. I think historic homes carries with it an assumption that there's been some finding by a professional that a home is historic. We have a lot of old homes, but we don't have any that, to my knowledge, are on any register in the district. Again, it's certainly been the practice that when folks come in, and a lot of that kind of legwork happens before the item makes it before the planning commission. We're working with architects or the developer to provide examples and to work with them on the examples they provide of homes in the neighborhood that are old, they would meet the definition of historic that I think the author of that email was implying. But I think to put historic here would not necessarily make sense.
Well, doesn't that take on it's kind of a legal connotation as far as registered historic districts? I'm just thinking my brother lives on Heritage Hill in Grand Rapids, and it's a whole nother ballgame when you have an historic home down there.
I think it's implied. I don't think it would in any way be limiting. But I think I would also argue that there are homes in the district and there are probably other homes in the city that are not necessarily historic, but that are old and have architectural merit. And so just for an example, a craftsman style home or a bungalow that was maybe built in the 40s or the 30s may be perceived to have some architectural value that we'd want to replicate. I don't know that we would classify those as historic either. So again, whether or not that word is included, I don't know that it will have any impact on the actual utilization of the process.
Well, I was thinking if it actually was included in there, it might actually give a developer more leeway to do whatever they want if they can make a case that there are no historic homes in the area that they're going to be redeveloping in. So since there's no historic precedent in that neighborhood, they can essentially do what they want. Of course, there'd be a check on it, but still, I prefer it not be in there.
Okay.
And I know that a few years ago there was some beginnings of exploration of a historic district in Mount Pleasant, and that just landed with an absolute thud. There was no interest in limiting the ability of people to do what they wanted with their homes. The word historic in there, honestly, that scares me a little bit.
I'll tell you that, again, that's an issue I think would be worthy of some discussion with the Zoning Board of Appeals on what the expectations are so that staff's aware, since, again, a lot of that early negotiation takes place with staff before these projects make it before the Zoning Board of Appeals or the Planning Commission. And it would also be helpful, staff to the ZBA is Brian Kench, our building official, and then you know me. Neither one of us are architects, and we certainly have our aesthetic preferences, and they may or may not be representative of your feelings or the community's feelings. So I think we would both be open, and it would certainly be helpful if anyone wanted to provide us with examples that we can then use in our discussions with the developers on the kind of features to replicate in new projects. We're very open to that. We basically just take the approach of when we see something we like, we suggest it be replicated. It's not a terribly formal process, but this is not a terribly formal process. It's a flexible process. So I think we're certainly sensitive to bringing some diversity to the type of architecture that comes in while still making sure that it's compatible with what's been there and with what's coming to the neighborhood. So, other questions on this item? Great. Continuing with goal number 2, currently we have a provision that enters any dwelling unit in an apartment dwelling, so that would be a dwelling that has 3 or more units facing a rear yard at a distance of less than 50 feet of the rear lot line, and then that's where the current language ends. What we're proposing to do is add a provision that says when that rear lot line abuts a property in the R zoning district. And the intention there, again, is going back to the neighborhood look and feel, that if we're going to require more units per building, that has the effect of, in a way, undermining the goal of creating the look of a single-family property. And so what we'd like to have, what we're suggesting is that there be some flexibility so that if you can tuck a second unit's entranceway to the rear, that helps to preserve that single-family look. Again, this would only be for those properties where the rear lot line is shared with another property in a different zoning district than in our district. So if you're in the transition area, you would still be subject to this rule that within 50 feet you couldn't have a rear entrance. I think would be meaningful when applied to a property that's going to have multiple units to enable the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Commission to basically negotiate a project that's going to look less like a 2 or 3 or 4 unit and more like a 1 unit building. Number 3, maintaining the involvement of the Zoning Board of Appeals in the review of non-conforming redevelopment projects. Again, this is largely the same language that was in the as-is proposal that went before the Planning Commission previously. This, again, it just basically codifies the redevelopment procedure that was endorsed in 2012 and 2013 to explain the Zoning Board of Appeals' role in the process. Questions on this part?
Isn't there language in here that something about, but you still have to abide by the limits of units or the limits of how many people you can put in a RSO? I mean, you say you can add 2 to the land permitted. I thought there was language that, because you also mean you can't go above and beyond
Right.
the per unit. I just thought I read that language occurred there again.
Are
Maybe
you
not.
talking the overall occupancy, or, because that's the last sentence right there.
What this section does do is it
Is that
clarifies.
complies with subsection 2?
Permitted by,
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say what this section does do in part 2 is it clarifies one element of the current procedure that has been controversial, which is the provision of the bonus occupants and what they're based on. And so you may recall that for most projects that have gone through the process, those bonus occupants have been awarded on top of what the land area allows. But in a few isolated incidents, that's been, those occupants have been awarded on top of the current license. And that license number may be higher in those cases than the land area. And so this clarifies and would essentially eliminate that potential. So if you had a property licensed for more than the land area allows, you wouldn't be eligible for bonus occupants, essentially, by that rule.
And I will ask the group, on these border properties, is 2 additional occupants over the maximum permitted by land area still an okay opportunity?
I don't know that it would be so feasible in the transition area when, you know, you're limited to 4 occupants a unit. There might not be enough space to have enough units to have the 2 additional occupants.
I think I
But if the
agree.
land use, what I'm thinking, if the land size might have been a 3 and 3 in 2 units, then conceivably you could get a 4 and 4, or maybe you could get a 4 and a 3, something like that, and still keep the occupancy per dwelling unit at 4. But if your land was at 4 and 4, you couldn't stuff in a 5 and 4. It maxes out at 4 per dwelling unit. That's the way that I understand it.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, that's how I understand it.
You're correct.
I was just thinking it was a total of 8 and an extra 2 were approved. The chances of putting a 3rd dwelling unit on that property is probably low.
I don't see any lots that are big enough in the
Given the
area
size
that
of
we're all
those
worried
lots,
about.
I don't think it's going to happen.
Like,
Especially
Mr.
when
McCann
we
said,
can't combine lots.
You get outside of this area that everybody's actually talking about in the other M2s, and it might be a different story. But the area that everybody's worried about, I think this would basically put a halt to any redevelopment. So I don't think we're going to have to worry about it.
Part 4, reducing the impact of on-site parking. This is a change to the parking section of the code. So this is outside of the M2 zoning district regulations. Section 121 currently states that all parking areas other than those for single-family and duplex units shall provide adequate access by means of maneuvering lanes so that backing directly onto a street is unnecessary. So essentially that says that for any residential, any use citywide, that's not just residential uses, but anything that's not single or 2-family duplex use must have a parking lot essentially to provide for the parking. There must be a driving aisle. That driving aisle by our standards must be at least 20 feet wide. And essentially that means that any car that arrives, that pulls into that lot has to be able to pull out forward. There can't be any reverse maneuvers into that right of way from those properties. This change, well, first I've made the substitution of 2-family for duplex because we don't have a duplex definition in our zoning ordinance. We have a 2-family definition. They mean the same thing. I'd prefer to have the 2-family because it's just a lot cleaner because that's what we have defined in the zoning ordinance. But essentially it adds a provision, again, based on the feedback about the parking lots and their incompatibility with the neighborhood, that for these smaller sites, and I think what we will see, I'm not sure what effect, to go to Commissioner Cotter's point, I can't predict what effect this is going to have on whether redevelopment halts or whether the new rules are just as enticing as the current rules. Maybe we see more redevelopment. I don't know. But what we will see are projects because of the lack of lot combination. And so I would expect that this provision could be used at the discretion, again, if they wish to propose it. There's nothing saying that they can't propose a parking lot, but if we want to negotiate with a developer to provide stacked parking, basically says that you can have up to 5 spaces stacked or the unit occupancy, whichever is less. And there, the rationale is that if your car is blocked in by the person in the apartment below you, it's pretty hard to work with them to get your car out. So the idea is that roommates could have a shared parking arrangement. This would be akin to what you see in most of our community where the vast majority of homes don't have double-loaded driveways. particularly in this neighborhood. They have single-lane driveways. Those single-lane driveways may stretch, the length, the depth of the property. So they'd be able to do that up to 10 total parking spaces. So if in theory, let's say outside of the transition area, you were able to accommodate 10 occupants, you could conceivably have a 5-lane driveway on one side of the house for 5 cars and one on the other for 5 cars, in lieu of having a 10-space parking lot, which you can imagine is going to take up a great deal more space. And this also just further states that if you do provide unstacked parking, if you're over those limits and you don't wish to do it, you have to provide that maneuvering lane. So it's not an out to get out of providing a parking lot if what you're building is a parking lot. It's just a provision to allow for a more of a traditional residential driveway arrangement for those properties. Part 5, eliminating incentives for and providing restrictions on the combination of existing platted lots. We spent quite a bit of time back in March and also again in June talking a little bit about the existing nonconformities in the district, a big one of which is lot area and lot width. Not all, but many properties in the M2 district, particularly between High and Bellows, have lots that were platted at less than 66 feet and much less than 8,000 square feet of land area. So what that means is that in order to go through the current redevelopment process, there's an encouragement to make your lot conforming. And how do you make a lot conforming that's not conforming? Well, you need more land. And so what happens is folks take 2 lots and turn that into their development site. So what this does is it aims to make those existing lots conforming. So that's one area that they're not having to add a lot in order to meet conformance. The other thing changing here is an elimination of the basically Part H rule under the height, bulk, density, and area requirements. That rule will be maintained for the M1 district, so it's not eliminated from the zoning ordinance, but it would not apply to the M2 district. What that rule says is that you have to have at least 2,900 square feet of land area per dwelling unit. And so that's where, as I got to earlier, our current regulation really prohibits or provides a strong incentive not to split a rooming and boarding dwelling into units. And what I heard from you in our work sessions was there was a desire, a concern about the high number of occupants per unit and that it fed into the party culture. And so if we want to see more units created, then we need to eliminate a restriction on creating units, and that's what's happening there. Continuing with Part 5, we've added a section to the M2 regulation that says lots existing as of July 1 may not be combined for the purposes of constructing a rooming and boarding dwelling. Required parking for rooming and boarding dwellings must be provided on the same lot as the principal structure. That's going to apply, again, not just for redevelopment projects. That's an M2 district regulation. So this is outside of the redevelopment process. This is for all M2 properties, eliminating that combination of lots for redevelopment. So what you have for property, you need to meet all of your requirements on that existing platted lot. Part 6, allow for continued occupancy incentives with explicit limitations. So again, going back to Part 2, we saw that earlier, permitting up to 2 additional occupants over the maximum permitted by land area. That's currently an element of the redevelopment procedure that is not clarified. And we've used current licensed occupancy and we've used maximum permitted by land area. In the application of bonus occupants, this will limit it to land area. Section 154.054C1E, this is under registered student organizations. This is the limitation on occupancy per unit in a registered student organization. This would limit it to 12. This is in all areas of the M2 district. You'll recall from the earlier language that registered student organization dwellings are not permitted in the transition area by the rule. So those wouldn't appear in the transition area under any circumstance. Section 154.054C2E, that's again reiterating, that's the same language you saw before, just presented again in relationship to this goal. This is the creation of that transition area, the limitation to 4 occupants per unit where there's a shared lot line or where there's a location of an R district property across a local street or alley from the subject property. And for all of the rooming and boarding dwelling units in the M2 district, a limitation to 6 occupants per dwelling unit.
Again, I want to make sure that I'm clear on this, that the wording on this, it says 12 occupants per unit. That is a different definition than dwelling unit, correct?
That is a dwelling unit.
Okay, so I guess I'm,
A dwelling unit is a subset of a dwelling. So within a registered student organization dwelling, you can have no more than 12 occupants per unit. So you could have theoretically separate housekeeping units for an RSO that were over 12 at the site. But you would have no more than 12 sharing common kitchens, meeting the definition of a dwelling unit.
okay.
But good question.
So in the RSO case, that means building?
That means dwelling unit. Dwelling would be equivalent, I think, to the common understanding of building. So this building has multiple tenants that reside in their respective units. An apartment building might have 7 apartments, so it has 7 dwelling units. It's one dwelling because it's one building. I know the terminology in the zoning ordinance is always fun, and every community has a different approach in how they use it, and we can quibble about our approach, but
We would never have the land to have a dwelling that had 2 units for 12.
I won't say never, only because the M2 district extends outside of the High and Bellows region. And I think in that region, there are very few lots. Primarily, there are lots that are located to the western end of the neighborhood adjacent to the railroad tracks where there's existing multiple family properties primarily, I believe. I'm sure those could accommodate more than 1 unit. But the vast majority of the traditional residential lots would never come near allowing 12, period. Where you might see that would be somewhere like the Edgewood-Deming area. You've got larger lots. There's a pocket of M2 off of Broomfield Road. Those are larger lots. But there aren't many large lots in the M2, the quote-unquote M2 area that I think most people associate with M2.
But keep in mind, these are RSO only, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
All right, final item in your package is just a text cleanup. This is just attributable to staff's obsessive compulsive disorder. Currently, section 54D1 states all site plans other than single or family duplex residential buildings shall be submitted to the Planning Commission for its review and approval before a building permit is issued. This is a clause within the M2 zoning district. All I've suggested is that we, again, rather than using what I would consider a fairly clumsy wording, a family duplex, because a family duplex isn't a defined term. Anywhere else we've used the word duplex in the zoning ordinance, we simply call it a duplex. It's not a family duplex. And a two-family is a duplex, is a two-family. So just a desire that while we're moving forward a huge package of text changes, we might as well clean up a little bit of clumsy language. So that's what that aims to do. So just to review, I want to really stress that what's before you today is my best attempt to implement the vision that you set for redevelopment in this neighborhood. So I've taken what you provided me over the months, and particularly at our June work session, and tied those to the specific text change items that are before you. This essentially amounts to a very substantially revised as-is process. It creates a meaningful transition to the R districts through lower permitted occupancies per unit. It clarifies that bonus occupancy incentives will be based on the 1 to 900 land area occupancy, not the current licensed occupancy. It limits occupancies per unit throughout the entire M2 district. So right now, there is no such limitation anywhere in M2. That's a big change. Reduces the impact of on-site parking on neighborhood aesthetics. Again, that's one change that I think is relatively minor from a zoning approach, but I think that'll have major visual impact on the neighborhood as properties continue to redevelop. They'll preserve the existing neighborhood integrity by limiting lot combinations. So again, we'll eliminate sort of the jagged tooth look of some blocks that we have in the M2 district currently, where there used to be a house, and a house, and now there's a house, a parking lot, maintaining that neighborhood integrity. They'll continue to facilitate a higher quality redevelopment. And I believe that the quality of redevelopment you're going to see out of this procedure is going to be higher than what you're seeing out of the current M2 redevelopment procedures. And finally, it's going to codify the process, which for those of you who were on the commission or who were following this issue back in 2013, that was really the initial request. In 2012, it was requested that the process be documented. In 2013, the request was that it be put into the code. And so if nothing else, this does that. This puts the process into the code. So my recommendation this evening is that you recommend the City Commission adopt text change 1506. If you choose to do that tonight, staff has provided a request to the City Commission that at their meeting this Monday, they set a public hearing for September 24th at their City Commission meeting. That would be the next step towards adoption. And assuming, if we were to assume adoption at the September 24th City Commission meeting, I would ask to work with you and the Zoning Board of Appeals members to set a time for us to have a joint meeting so that we can discuss implementing and moving forward with this process. So with that, I'd welcome to entertain any further questions you have.
Any more questions for Mr. Kane? I think we got a lot of them answered during your presentation. But does anybody have anything else before the public? No? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. At this time, we will open up public comment on this topic. Keep in mind, you'll have 5 minutes to speak. I'm going to be timing people this time so we don't go too long.